Hey, Julie here. Just really quickly before we dive into the episode today, and it's a good one. I'm so excited for you to hear it. I need to ask you a favor. Would you consider sharing Top of Mind with a friend? We love what we do here, and we really want to bring more people in so together we can make our communities better. But we need your help. There should be a share button in the app you're using to listen to this podcast. You could just click it right now and text Top of Mind to a friend. Thank you so much for being a regular listener of the show. We couldn't do it without you. Okay, let's go.
I think the First Amendment is like the greatest law in the history of the world.
The law cannot be our moral compass. And historically, the law has been bent to do a lot of damage to our communities.
I don't think a college, say, or a university, we're going to make you feel comfortable here. We're going to protect you, against harassment. But there are going to be some ideas that make you feel uncomfortable, and you might grow from them. That could be a difficult process for an 18-year-old.
I'm Julie Rose, and this is Top of Mind. I have been a radio journalist for 2 decades, but a few years ago, I found myself avoiding the news for long stretches because of how depressing and divisive it all seems. I still wanted to be informed and engaged on important issues, though, and I figured I couldn't be alone in that. So we created this podcast. Each episode, we tackle one tough topic in a way that will challenge you, help you feel more empathy, and empower you to become a better citizen, a kinder neighbor, and a more effective advocate. Today, how free should speech really be on college campuses?
I had been having the most wonderful time at school.
Jillian Letterman was a big free speech enthusiast when she arrived at Brown University in 2021.
I grew up in a fairly conservative family, and we were in a Massachusetts suburb, which was pretty left-leaning. We were constantly encouraged to debate each other, to talk politics around the dinner table. At Brown, it was a very similar sort of left-leaning environment that I had that backing of constantly wanting the political disagreement and the political discourse. And in my mind, it was the constitutional standard. Up until it incites violence, it is okay to be said. Sometimes it's offensive, sometimes it is worth ending a friendship over, but it should be allowed, it should not be censored. So that was my pretty much free speech absolutism all the way until October 7th.
October 7th, 2023, when Hamas attacked Israel and the war in Gaza began. Jillian was in her senior year at Brown and a Jewish student leader.
I was the president of Brown Students for Israel, which was our pro-Israel club on campus. And I also was the chair of a more national group of pro-Israel leaders on campuses across the country. And so I was really in a leadership position during that time. We had 2 days of vigils, and then almost immediately after that, there were protests on campus saying, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. This was an act of resistance. Long live the Intifada. There's only one solution, Intifada revolution. And my immediate reaction was, this is an attack. What they're saying is leading directly to some of the manifestations of violence that we saw in those weeks, such as a student at Cornell who issued death threats to the Jewish community and was then arrested, or a student at Tulane who was hit in the head with a Palestinian flagpole.
Within weeks, Letterman published an opinion piece in the New York Times with 2 other Jewish student leaders under the headline, "What is happening on college campuses is not free speech." They called for universities to crack down on taunts and intimidation of Jewish students, punish the participants, and revoke funding from student groups involved in the protests.
What happened was that for the students for whom Israel was a core aspect of their Jewish identity, that was immediately viewed as you have become enemy number one on campus. I would go to a party and there would be, in one specific instance, 2 men who came up to me and accused me of supporting genocide and wouldn't leave me alone and required the intervention of my friends to move out of that situation. And a lot of times universities were not disciplining the students for doing so and allowing this narrative to emerge that said, these students are just protesting in favor of free speech and we need to preserve their free speech. Well, as I said in the piece, it was mob harassment that cannot be confused with free speech. I think I've had an evolution since then in how I view that time period because it was such an emotional reaction. And I think that the Times piece was an expression of that. The problem was that my perspective on what speech constituted an incitement to violence became broader. And that is where I think that I went wrong, and I think a lot of students went wrong during that time.
College campuses have always been a main stage for the national debate over what can be said and what can't. The First Amendment protects virtually all speech from government censorship, no matter how hateful or offensive. The Supreme Court says it is okay to silence only when it's a direct threat, encourages illegal behavior, or incites violence. But exactly what constitutes a threat or incitement? As we've seen on so many campuses across the country in this last year, a protest slogan one group finds empowering can be felt by another as a call for violence and intimidation. And universities have other things besides free speech to consider. Yes, they're supposed to be places of intellectual exploration, political activism, and boundary pushing, but they're also obligated by federal anti-discrimination laws and policy to ensure a welcoming, harassment-free learning environment and take student complaints seriously. So what is a university to do when a group of students feels uncomfortable or even unsafe because of a certain protest activity, presentation, or perspective on campus? A 2024 Knight Foundation report found 1 in 4 college students think schools need to protect students by banning speech they may find offensive or biased. That's the largest share of students to answer that way since the survey first asked the question in 2016. 2024 also set a record for the number of attempts to disrupt or disinvite speakers, cancel performances, take down art exhibits, and prevent the screening of films on U.S. college campuses. That's according to the free speech advocacy group FIRE. So today on Top of Mind, what do these competing interests to defend expression and protect well-being on campus mean for students and administrators trying to strike a balance? Jillian Letterman, the Jewish student leader who was at Brown in 2023, says she's now returned to her more absolutist views on free speech. And some of what she wrote in that New York Times article, she says, went too far.
The part where I talk about professors needing to be disciplined for certain phrases or student groups needing to either be kicked off of campus or, have funding rescinded from them because they said certain things, that I'm uncomfortable with now. I felt like the crux of the issue was that there had been this double standard that college campuses over the past decade or maybe a little bit more have been viewed as places where people are protected, and colleges have microaggression sessions, and the overriding approach is if someone on campus says that they are feeling targeted or offended or in any way hurt on the basis of their identity, everyone steps back and says, this is horrifying and we need to take immediate administrative action. And then that same thing happened to the Jewish community on campus, and everyone started screaming free speech. And that feeling of a double standard was very, very visceral for a lot of us, and I think led to a lot of some of these free speech demands or desires to restrict free speech that in the long run I think are far more damaging.
How do you feel now about the "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" chant?
I still think it's an important phrase. And I think that when we have slogans that are in any way tied to a particular group, that group then says, this is offensive, this is, in my view, promoting violence against my community, immediately everyone takes a step back and says, okay, we're not using this anymore. We're not using this term. We're not using this phrase. This is not okay anymore because that group has the discretion to decide that. And now you have the majority of the Jewish community saying, this is a phrase that does not leave any room for nuance. It doesn't say, I believe in Palestinian rights. It doesn't say, I believe everyone should be equal under the law. It says, from the river to the sea, the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, Israel should not exist anymore because Palestine needs to be free and rid of Israel entirely. And that doesn't leave room for nuance. It doesn't leave room for discussion. I think people should be able to say whatever they want. They should absolutely be able to scream that slogan in the streets if they'd like to. But I personally consider it abhorrent, and I think that it reflects sort of a, diminution of what our society is and how we treat a particular group in our society. It says that your voice doesn't matter. It says that we don't treat you the same that we treat other minority groups, other individuals. So I feel similar about it, but I think people should still be able to say it.
Okay, so but help me understand that, though. Why you think people should be able to say it, but ideally, if a group says, this is offensive to me, in a perfect society, we would stop saying it?
There are a lot of things that people can say that are horrible things to say, that are offensive things to say, that they should have a right to say. And I think this falls into that category. If we want to have a productive discussion about what needs to happen in that conflict that embraces all of the nuances of the conflict and the different priorities, different perspectives, different religious groups living there, different ethnic groups, then let's have that conversation. A lot of the same students who marched and said those chants at Brown and at other schools are the very same ones who were marching to shut down Zionist speakers on campus and preventing students from going to those events. So if you believe in free speech, and I think the universities absolutely need to in order to survive, then they have to establish from the very outset for every single freshman class, this community believes in freedom of speech. We believe in respect for opposing opinions. We will not censor you. In your classes, you will encounter people who you disagree with, and your professors might disagree with you, and you should revere that and seek that out and encourage that. And that being a contributor to the campus community, being a productive member of that society, obligates you to respect beliefs from all across the aisle and proceed with the understanding that other students might disagree with you, might engage with you in a way that you don't love or isn't easy for you.
Jillian Letterman graduated from Brown University in May 2024 with a degree in political science and economics. She's currently an editorial fellow at the Wall Street Journal and writes frequently about free speech. Now, most college students in America, when asked directly, will say that free speech is an important right. But the percentage of college students saying they have personally felt uncomfortable due to speech about race, gender, religion, or sexual orientation has almost doubled since 2017, according to that Knight Foundation survey. And when asked if they've actually felt unsafe, not just uncomfortable, because of something someone said about their race, ethnicity, or religion, it's Black and Hispanic students who are most likely to say yes. 85% of Black college students say hate speech should not be allowed on campus. Among them is Kaleb Autman.
I am an undergrad student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm a sociology and legal studies double major.
Autman's activism on campus around restricting harmful speech started with an incident in the spring of 2023.
We had a white woman, student at UW-Madison, post a very hateful video that spread like wildfire on campus. She said that Black people should go back to picking cotton. And that was the speech that kind of galvanized Black students, faculty, and community members, and our allies, right? To say, hey, this is not acceptable. But it also wasn't the focus. I think a lot of our frustration with this incident comes out of being at a predominantly white institution that doesn't give as much structural support to students of color than other students, or at least even help us navigate it.
Only about 3% of University of Wisconsin students are Black.
I like to say we live in a sea of whiteness, and it's something that I'm not used to being from Chicago, right? You come to UW-Madison as a Black student, and you're thrown into a campus that has tens of thousands of people roaming the streets every single day who don't look like you. It gets isolating. So essentially, we created a list of demands to go to the university that stretched beyond just this incident, right? Like, yes, we wanted her to face some sort of repercussions. And then also there were elements of it really talking about how will the university combat microaggressions, overtly racist, sexist, homophobic rhetoric to make sure that the speech that is vile, that is dangerous, does not seep into the ether just because underneath the First Amendment. The law cannot be our moral compass. It should not. And historically, especially for communities that look like mine, the law has been bent and used to do a lot of damage to our communities.
Now, all universities in the United States have competing obligations on this issue. But the situation is slightly different for public versus private schools. As government entities, public universities are required to uphold the First Amendment protection on virtually all speech, no matter how offensive. Private universities have a bit more leeway to establish campus speech codes, but enforcing those rules too aggressively or unequally can lead to public backlash, lawsuits, even televised grilling by Congress if it's an Ivy League school. All universities, public and private, are required by civil rights provisions, known as Title IX and Title VI, to ensure a campus environment that's free from discrimination or harassment based on race, gender, religion, national origin, or sexual orientation. And then there is the almost universal desire of universities to cultivate a diverse student body, which, in Kaleb Autman's view, is an especially compelling reason to limit some kinds of speech on campus.
In order to keep us, you have to care for us. And we cannot walk around a campus where we're 2% of the population and feel less safe and less protected than a person who can spew all type of historically inaccurate, harmful, hateful speech. And then they get, well, there's nothing that we can do about it because we're a public university. We believe in free speech, or we have a diversity of thought. And it's also like, we have to come up with the answers ourselves, right? This is not Kaleb Autman or Black people create the solutions. We all need to be in this together of saying, okay, what will it take for us to all coexist? Will it take for us to, if the university is saying that we want more diverse students, more Black and brown students, you can't bring us here and then treat us like and allow us to take beatings from everything from the lecture halls to the library to, the streets that we walk on.
Can you be a little more specific about what the beatings are?
Yeah, I'll just go down some instances where we're on a campus that we've seen Nazis march down State Street and around our Capitol, right? That is something that isn't new to us. We go into the libraries and we see messages scribbled on the wall that are just vile language. We've had figurines lynched on Fraternity Row. We've had Black women called outside by people driving by. People criticize your hair, or they, on the flip side of it, of like, you're eloquent, right? This notion that we're here because we're diversity hires, right? And then in the academic side, we take beatings every single day in the lecture halls where we're overlooked, where you can have tenured professors assign very harmful readings that don't necessarily line up with many of the lived experiences of your communities. And not only that, it's refuted by other academic work. Other students, they have the luxury of they can fall into the shadows of a classroom, but Black students, we feel like we need to show up and be excellent every single time. And when we don't feel like we're excellent, we feel like we're failing ourselves, our communities, and it's also noticeable. These are all beatings that they culminate, right?
Yeah, so like beating you down, sort of like consistently kind of undermining your sense of belonging, identity, confidence.
Community, yeah.
And it must be exhausting, I would think.
It is exhausting. It is.
So then what about in the cases, so a lot of times when we talk about speech, right, then it's like, well, what speech are we going to limit? I think a lot of universities could totally get behind, no racial slurs, no, lynching signs, that kind of thing. What about in a sociology class where you're discussing the history of race in America? Would it be acceptable for a white student to challenge, as part of that discussion, to challenge the notion of white privilege? Or to argue that, Black people can be racist too, right? Would that kind of discussion also be the kind of thing that you would like to see not happen at the University of Wisconsin.
No, absolutely not. That's not what I'm arguing at all. I think Ta-Nehisi Coates puts it very well that language lives within the context of something, right?
Okay.
If you are trying to challenge something, let's have the discussion. But also knowing part of that labor is on the students of color, the marginalized voices in that room to carry that discussion, to work through that. Let's be frank, and that's a beating and tiring as well, because we think, right, some of these conversations are very elementary and we're at a collegiate level and people haven't done the reading, right? Studies have shown that students are not doing the reading. So I think that, yes, if it's in the name of learning and knowledge, we want to do that. But what cannot be done is I'm going to say this thing that may not be grounded in historical fact and research, may be bigoted to some people, depending on who you talk to. I'm not going to be able to say that thing within a classroom setting and then chalk it up to it's my opinion or want to step back from it.
Yeah. Where did you come down, or where do you come down on the Palestinian, the pro-Palestinian protests, the anti-Israel speech, Jewish students saying we don't feel safe, when you have students, calling Israel genocidal or calling for from the river to the sea, right? Do you identify with the Jewish students who say this language is harmful and aggression toward me?
Mm-hmm. So first, I'll just set the stage is I believe in Palestinian liberation, right? Free Palestine. I think that Israel is a settler colonialist empire that is built off of displacement, dispossession, and genocide. I'm very straight up. I want the audience and everyone to know that's where I stand, right? Why? Because I see that a part of my experience too, right? I come from Black people in America. We do not like oppression. We do not like people dying. We do not like seeing women and children dying. And that's every side, right? I think in terms of the speech of that, and I have not looked into it much, but I would be surprised to see pro-Palestinian organizers, activists, groups actually targeting Jewish people, right? In my understanding, people are not using that term or that quotation to advocate for the eradication of Jews or Judaism. What they are saying that Israel, which is a settler colony, it's a nation state, a supposed democracy, is occupying indigenous Palestinian land, which the historic record is very clear about this. And yeah, so I can hear Jewish students saying that I don't feel safe, but at the core of that safety, is there a threat to them personally? On the flip side of that, they can say Israel has the right to exist and whatever it wants to do, it should be able to do. Is that okay for them to say? And then Palestinian organizers and their allies are not able to reaffirm Palestinian life and dignity and self-determination. When people fight for their liberation, someone is always going to be offended.
So you would be opposed to any chants if a chant broke out at the encampment, a pro-Palestinian encampment that said Jews must die. Like, that would not be acceptable.
Absolutely not. But at the end of the day, power and privilege are the two main factors in speech and how the world runs, right? And right now, who has the power? Who has the privilege?
Sure.
And it's not that I want to be more lenient on those who are marginalized or are victims of any system of oppression in any nation, settler nation state, because they also have limits, right? To call for what is done to you onto someone else is still harmful and violent, right? But sometimes words are the only tool that people have to express themselves and to resist and to build other worlds. When my ancestors spoke and they wrote and they sang and they danced, and they were doing it in their own silos in many cases, right? But even through that, they wanted to generate a new world for us all. And I'm just picking up the mantle of that.
Kaleb Bakari Autman is a student filmmaker and social justice organizer at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He's double majoring in sociology and legal studies. It's not just universities feeling pressure to censor speech. Close to 70% of students, that's 2 out of 3, told the Knight Foundation they have censored themselves during classroom discussions, particularly around race, religion, or gender, and LGBTQ+ issues. The left-leaning political nature of most college campuses means that Republican students are more likely to self-censor on those topics, but only slightly.
This is happening for students regardless of their political beliefs. You have students who are saying, I'm like a strong Democrat. I'm left-leaning. I have the majority view on my college campus, and I'm still scared of social reprisal for expressing my opinions.
We'll look at that trend next. This is Top of Mind, a BYU radio podcast. I'm Julie Rose. Okay, Top of Mind listeners, before we get right back to today's episode, I would like to introduce you to another gem of a show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts. It's In Good Faith. It's hosted by Stephen Cap Perry, and on each episode, he interviews members of different religions and spiritualities to better understand their relationship with the divine. Whether you wish to strengthen your own relationship or just listen to thoughtful conversations about religion, dive into an enriching world of spiritual exploration with Stephen Cap Perry on In Good Faith. Listen anywhere you get podcasts.
Before the summer of 2020, all you really needed to be like a good UVA student who sort of fit in with the crowd was to be vaguely liberal, right? And I was that.
Meet Emma Camp.
I'm an associate editor at Reason Magazine, where I cover things like education and free speech and civil liberties. And I graduated from the University of Virginia in 2022. I suppose everything comes back to what my childhood was like, which is that I grew up in sort of a rural-ish part of Alabama, and my parents were strident Democrats. And I was in an environment where everybody was way more religious than me and way more conservative than me. I was like the only Democrat I knew for miles around. And, you know, I was the 8-year-old who was on the playground having arguments about Obamacare, right? Like I was watching MSNBC with my dad every night. And in that environment, if you want to make friends, you have to be okay, especially if you're like me and you come out of the womb as this like contrarian monster. Like you have to be okay with being friends with people with whom you disagree.
So it was a novel thing to find herself in the viewpoint majority as a liberal when she arrived at the University of Virginia. But
there was a really big difference between my first 2 years at UVA and my last 2 years at UVA. There was sort of a larger sort of, I guess for lack of a better term, sort of Overton window of like things that you could be and still be within the bounds of social acceptability. That narrowed quite a lot after the summer of 2020, right? I started noticing everybody around me was calling themselves a leftist, right? And so suddenly if you were a liberal, that was bad. You were not supposed to be a liberal. You had to be a leftist. And being a leftist required these very specific things of you. And if you expressed any opinion that sort of went just a little bit outside of the acceptable view, whatever that may be, there was this really intense social backlash. And so suddenly things that I had, been able to sort of non-controversially express before, like, I think free speech is really important and people have and should have the legal right to say offensive things, even if I don't agree with what they're saying, that suddenly was not so popular.
What happened that pandemic summer of 2020?
It was part of the larger sort of reckoning that we were having, where there was just like a lot of intense political frustration. And I think for a lot of university students who cannot control the broader political landscape and who especially for people that were having a lot of anguish over, say, police brutality, right? If you're just a random college student, you cannot stop a police officer from killing somebody, right? There's nothing you can do about that. But what you can do is yell at everybody you know about that, right? And I think part of why the pandemic era was important for that as well is that everybody was all cooped up at home. Nobody was talking to each other, right? Just the tenor of the conversations got much more volatile. And I think part of that is the being online part, and also the ways in which being online it gives another stage on which you should perform having the right beliefs, the quote unquote right beliefs, right? Let's say race in America. You didn't really have the option to not take a side. Yeah. And the sides were very narrow in their conception. It was a lot harder to sort of be like, well, policing is a really complicated policy issue, and like there are things that need to be improved, but obviously the victims of crime also like to, there wasn't room for those kind of squishy, nuanced conversations that are actually important to have.
So Emma Camp started writing about all this in the campus paper and ultimately got an opinion published in the New York Times lamenting the level of self-censorship students feel on college campuses. And social media lit up with critics calling for her cancellation.
I think a lot of people have framed this issue, even after I wrote the piece, as, well, this is just, like dirty Republicans. Like, it's just these like hateful, racist conservatives where people are no longer putting up with their hatefulness. And that isn't quite true, because this is happening for students regardless of their political beliefs. You have students who are saying, no. I'm like a strong Democrat. I'm left-leaning. I have the majority view on my college campus, and I'm still scared of social reprisal for expressing my opinions. And the reason why this is so important, or at least I thought it was so important to me, is it isn't just bad for the individual student experiencing self-censorship, it's bad for the whole university environment. Because if people are scared of social backlash, if they voice a differing opinion, it prevents the people who hold that majority view from fully understanding the issue at stake. It's like a challenge to what a university is supposed to do, which is like impart knowledge and make people better thinkers. So like one example is, let's take a really complicated, fraught issue like abortion, right? And it does not surprise me that the, let's say, pro-life people I've encountered who have made the most compelling pro-life arguments either used to be pro-choice or know a lot of pro-choice people and understand why they believe what they believe, right? And so if you want to make an argument that abortion is impermissible, it's really important to understand why people think abortion is okay, right? But if you think that the only reason someone would think abortion is okay is because they're an evil baby murderer, you're not going to make like a very compelling or a very sound argument against abortion. And I think what we're seeing with this increasing self-censorship on college campuses, especially in the wake of all of the political controversy over Israel-Palestine that happened in the last year, is it's like this political viewpoint wide dampening of people's understanding of the other side, which I do think is like an existential problem, especially because self-censorship seems to be higher on elite colleges. And for better or for worse, the kinds of people that go to elite colleges are the people that are going to fill our government bureaucracy.
So how would you respond to a student who's a minority student in some way, has experienced some marginalization because of their race or their ethnicity or their gender or sexual identity or religion, and they say, okay, technically it's protected by the First Amendment, but this is harmful to me and to others like me, and it compounds because of the context and makes me feel less safe and less like I can engage. What do you say to that, do you think?
So I want to start by saying, like, yes, hearing offensive viewpoints, especially things that relate to experiences that we have personally, can be distressing, right? Censoring them isn't going to keep them from thinking that way. If anything, it's going to make them feel that way even more, right? If you say, I'm not so sure that white privilege is real, and then you get punished by the school in some way, you get censored, you get sent off to some kind of mandatory diversity training. Like, that's the best way to have somebody for life be like, I am never even considering this other concept ever again, right? Like, you can only change people's minds by trying to have a conversation with them. And even if, let's say, they're beyond, they're really unproductive, they're not interested in a conversation, like, it's so much better to know what people actually think, I would much rather know that somebody thinks that women can't be trusted in roles of power because our brains are too small and too stupid to be able to handle it. I want to know if somebody feels that way because it's going to affect how I think about them, right? And how seriously I take the other views that they have. I found the protesters who were cheering on October 7th to be really, really distasteful. But I think it was really, really good that they were allowed to say those things that I find very offensive, because it's sort of it's putting all their cards on the table. And I think people often say, well, aren't you you're defending the right of people to just be utterly terrible. This is one of the biggest problems I have with the way people talk about the First Amendment is that, doesn't defending free speech end up defending the bad guy? Right? It ends up defending people with power. And that cannot be further from the truth. It is those with power who have who are capable of deciding who to censor. It is the little guy. It is those with unpopular beliefs. For example, the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, would not have been possible without the First Amendment. And in fact, the people doing it had their First Amendment rights violated all the time. All opinions that actually challenge power, which includes a whole lot of these progressive views that are trying to make changes in this country in regard to racism or sexism or LGBT rights, they rankle those in power. And we need the First Amendment to protect them.
Emma Camp graduated from the University of Virginia in 2022 and is now an associate editor at the libertarian Reason magazine. She says she now identifies as a political independent with a passion for civil liberties. The stakes are extremely high right now for university administrators who are dealing with this stark divide over how to balance free speech rights and student safety on campus. In the last year, presidents of Harvard, Columbia, Cornell, and the University of Pennsylvania all stepped down amid pressure over their handling of protests against the war in Gaza and threats against Jewish students on campus. Officials at many other universities have come under fire for expressing their own views on controversial issues, or in some cases, failing to speak up.
We're not potted plants. College presidents, certainly in the 50s and 60s and 70s, were often leaders in their community. And then we became too timid. We were afraid of offending donors, offending students, and we lost our position. And I think America's college presidents need to reclaim that.
Next, we'll hear how one college president walked the line and managed to keep his job. This is Top of Mind from the BYU Radio Podcast Network. I'm Julie Rose. Hey friends, if you are looking for another great show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, check out Constant Wonder. Host Marcus Smith takes you on an exhilarating journey through captivating stories of our magnificent natural world. You'll gain profound insight into different facets of our planet, discover more about nature, and maybe even ponder your connection to Earth's wonder. The show is Constant Wonder, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts.
My name is Steve Bahls. I'm president emeritus of Augustana College. I was president for 19 years.
Bahls retired in 2022, and he now heads up a program coaching new college presidents for the Council of Independent Colleges. Augustana is a small liberal arts college of about 2,500 students in Rock Island, Illinois. Now, 2 decades is a really long time for a college president to stay on the job. The average is more like 6 years. Bahls chalks it up to his focus on collaborating with the entire campus community on big decisions. In fact, he says it was chalk that first highlighted the need for a better campus policy on free speech.
This was prior to the election of President Trump. His first election, the college Republicans chalked the campus. And every third sidewalk had a Trump 2016 logo. Feminism equals Nazism, build a wall. And there was great debate. Should we wash this off, or is it free speech? So we recognized then that we didn't really have a good free speech policy.
So did you allow it?
So, I prayed for rain, right? After about a week it rained. We had a community discussion of this, and it was decided that we would create a political zone on campus where there could be chalking. and you could chalk anything you wanted as long as it wasn't profane or obscene. That then was a nice compromise, right? You could express yourself, your political beliefs, your support or lack of support for Trump. It is free speech and political speech to say build the wall. It's stupid speech to say feminism equals Nazism, yet it is certainly protected in most concepts by First Amendment principles. Yet, if you were a student, you didn't have to walk past this every day on the way to class. Likewise, the community decided that you can't chalk these things outside the residence halls. So a Hispanic student, ought to be able to walk to class without the sidewalks in front of the residence halls having content that's offensive to them.
The new policy worked for a few years. And then came the heated summer of 2020.
It was after the murder of George Floyd. So there was quite a debate on campus about the college Republicans wanting to hold a Back the Blue rally on the heels of the Black students holding a vigil for lives lost. So there were calls to shut down the college Republicans, shut down Back the Blue rally.
But the rally seemed to pretty clearly qualify as protected political speech in the campus policy, says Bahls.
Now, in this case, because it was on the heels of a rally that was condemning police brutality, a vigil for lives lost, I actually asked the college Republicans, could you delay this a little bit, not do it in the next weekend? The answer was no. So that rally went ahead, Back the Blue. It was very sparsely attended, but we felt that it was within the free speech of these students. Now, did it make other students feel uncomfortable? Yes, it did. Did it, in a sense, make other students feel that Augustana College wasn't welcoming to everyone? Yes. This was a tough one for us because it's a value at Augustana College to be welcoming to all students. On the other hand, free speech is a near absolute at Augustana College, should be a near absolute. We learned at the time that although we had free speech policies, that the free speech policies were not sufficient to provide guidance to the administration on how to handle this conflict. And it was a heartfelt conflict.
So beyond deciding what could and couldn't be said, they needed a plan to help the campus community cope with the fallout.
If you just say students, First Amendment, suck it up, students don't buy that. So we felt that as an educational institution, we needed to educate our students on the importance of free speech and that the answer to being offended by free speech is not to shut it down, but more speech. The college held a colloquium on police violence the following weekend with representation of the local police department and the Augustana Police Department, trying to get parties to talk with each other.
So you're okay with students feeling uncomfortable on a campus that you preside over?
Well, I am okay with other students and other speakers stating things under their free speech rights which makes students feel uncomfortable. It is incumbent, however, then upon the college to mitigate that sense of uncomfortableness, to support those students with an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, to encourage those students to engage in alternative programming, to provide counseling to those students. You need to be uncomfortable from time to time. You need to have your opinions challenged. Justice Holmes in the 1919 case of United States versus Abrams said that the truth is best generated by creating a marketplace of ideas. Campuses should support those marketplace of ideas.
So how do you view, as a president, how do you view the students? Are they your customers? And at some point, are you obligated to give them what they want?
Students have some of the attributes of customers, but they're a special type of customer. They're a customer that we have a very high duty to. Yes, they pay the tuition. Yes, we want to try to give them the majors that they want, but we also want to challenge them to grow. In addition to your rallies, Why don't you think about talking college Democrats and college Republicans together? Are you listening to the other side? How would you respond to the other side? I mean, that's what the liberal arts do. It's a pretty critical, in a positive sense, evaluations of our assumptions, asking us to view our assumptions, challenge our assumptions. That could be a difficult process for an 18-year-old.
Is that a harder sell, though, as the price of a college education has increased so significantly?
Yeah, and some families feel that way. I mean, we're paying a lot for this college, notwithstanding the fact that a lot of this is coming from federal financial aid, state financial aid, college financial aid. But if you're coming to Augustana College just to feel comfortable, you might want to think of a different college. If you're coming to Augustana to grow in body, mind, and spirit, to be the problem solvers of tomorrow, you're at the right place. You know, one of the challenges is that our nation segregates itself by zip codes, right? Politically. That cannot happen to America's colleges and universities, but we're starting to see some evidence of that you go to a college that's going to kind of reinforce your views, which is why it's important for colleges like Augustana to have a robust set of college Republicans, Democrats, and so on, to challenge each other. But I don't think a college should say, or a university, we're going to make you feel comfortable here. We're going to protect you, against harassment, but there are going to be some ideas that make you feel uncomfortable, and you might grow from them.
And Bahls thinks college presidents themselves should be adding their own views to the conversation, even as the national trend is the opposite. College presidents are increasingly self-censoring for their own preservation.
So, for example, I spoke at the symposium we had on the murder of George Floyd, kind of criticizing our justice system. I'm a lawyer in my first profession, so I'm not hesitant to speak out on these things. Now, that's controversial. Some organizations say the president should be neutral. I don't believe that. When students are hurting, and our students were hurting with respect to the murder of George Floyd, it's okay for me to say Black Lives Matter, and it's okay for me to say that our system needs some reform. Now, does that anger some people on the right? Yes, but my job is to certainly be a spokesperson for the values of the college: human respect, dignity, growth in mind, body, and spirit, and free exchange of ideas.
But you're inherently choosing a side.
I am choosing a side, and that is risky for a college president, but we're not potted plants. College presidents, certainly in the 50s and 60s and 70s, were often leaders in their community, thought leaders on political institutions, and then we became too timid. We were afraid of offending donors, offending students, and we lost our position, I think, of being intellectual leaders, and I think America's college presidents need to reclaim that. Will there be pushback? Absolutely.
Did anyone ever threaten your job because of the statements that you were making, your personal statements?
No, my job was not threatened. Now, some of the statements I made, I think the college lost donors, disagreed with me and said I'm not going to donate to this institution. Mm-hmm. I think we gained donors too. Here we have a president that's candid. But I think it's incumbent upon presidents, as I did, to speak candidly with the community and with the board about what you're going to comment on or not comment on. So I actually had a document that the community agreed to, particularly the board. The president should comment on the following issues. So I was permitted to comment on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, welcoming of students, funding of higher education. I would not comment on such things as pro-choice versus pro-life, because I don't have any particular expertise in that area, right? But I do have...
Well, but you certainly have an opinion, right?
I have an opinion.
That could certainly tie into human dignity.
But I'm not sure that my opinion, is a more valuable opinion than the opinion of faculty and others. I do have expertise, however, on issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education, free speech in higher education, and funding of higher education. So I think where presidents run into problems is often when their political commentary extends past matters fundamental to their campus.
Well, what about the war in Gaza? If you had been president in the last year and a half, would you have taken a position in support of Israel or Palestinians?
So I would tie certainly what's happening in the Middle East to the values of our college: human dignity, human respect for individuals of various religions. So I would have condemned the violence on both sides, but I would not have taken a position on what Israel should do. I'm not an expert in that area, or what Hamas should do. But clearly, the human suffering there should be condemned. I think some presidents handled this quite well. The Northwestern University president, for example, came to an agreement with the protesters that occupied part of Northwestern. He was roundly criticized for that. But I mean, what's the alternative? Is he going to use the police department to clear the meadow where they were encamped, causing risk of injury to students? Rather, there was an agreement to allow Palestinian students, those supporting Hamas, to do so in other venues. So, a very tough thing for college presidents. But I would comment, because there's a nexus, right? A connection to the university. Students are feeling hurt, and students are feeling aggrieved. And in fact, at Northwestern and other schools, I mean, the educational mission of the institution was under fire. It was hard to hold classes.
What about the university itself taking a position on a social justice issue or on a political issue?
So I do think that for the university itself to take a position on a political issue is a dangerous thing to do, because there are mixtures of opinions. So my opinions, when I took a position with respect to the murder of George Floyd and the need to look at some police and criminal justice reform, I made it clear that that was my opinion. Now, that being said, 90% of the people that heard my opinion thought it was the opinion of Augustana College. So that's kind of dangerous ground. So you make that disclaimer. You hope that people hear that disclaimer. But presidents do need to be measured and careful. I ran my statements past many, many people, and they were refined many times. And, sometimes our PR people wanted to take the life out of it. And I'd say, I'm not a potted plant. Don't prepackage and blow dry me. Let some of my personality come through here. So it's quite a debate, on how strong that statement should be.
The way that you're describing having sort of moderated your message makes me wonder if that is something that you also expect faculty and students to do.
I don't think students and faculty have to self-moderate. And, what I would ask a faculty to do, they have academic freedom. And in a sense, you can state your opinions pretty strongly. But I hope you won't shut down debate in the classroom. So I hope if you have a strong opinion, for example, on the situation in the Middle East and Israeli policy, that you'll leave room to have a two-way discussion of that. Now, it's a little hard to do sometimes when the faculty member is stating one thing for students to disagree. But there are some things that can be done. I continue to teach at Augustana College, and you can ask students, disagree with me. Please disagree with me. Let's have a discussion of this. Faculty should not self-censor out of a fear of retribution. They have academic freedom. Academic freedom, in my opinion, has made our colleges and universities great. It has made our colleges and universities incubators of new ideas, sometimes challenging, from which our students can learn. Now, I hope that my measured comments might be a model for students, that we might, not take a sledgehammer to kill a fly in our comments, and that we might be more measured so the other side hears our comments. State your comments in a way that invites dialogue instead of a way that creates division. But students shouldn't self-censor. Faculty shouldn't self-censor. Academic freedom is pretty precious.
Stephen Bahls is President Emeritus of Augustana College. He's a senior advisor to the Council of Independent Colleges, directing the Presidential Vocation and Mission workshop. President Bahls, thank you so much for your time and your insight today. I appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure and honor to be with you.
So where do you think universities should draw the line with speech on campus? And do you think public and private universities should be subject to different free speech expectations? I always forget that the First Amendment only applies to the government. Private entities can restrict speech without running afoul of the Constitution. Is that a good thing, do you think? Reach out on social media. We're at Top of Mind Pod, or you can send an email to topofmind@byu.edu. I'd love to hear from you. And if First Amendment issues fascinate you as much as they do me, we've got a bunch of other Top of Mind episodes I think you'll like. We'll put some links to those in the show notes. Top of Mind is a BYU radio podcast. Today's episode was produced by Caleb Leach, James Hoops, and me, with help from Samuel Benson and Sam Payne. Our audio engineer and sound design team includes Brandon Lewis and Lauren Sandberg. I'm Julie Rose. We'll talk soon.